Hi, and welcome to the second installment of the video overview of the Immersive World Handbook. This is Chapter 2, Designing Effective, Immersive, and Creative Spaces. In this particular chapter, we'll expand on some of the key ideas that we developed in the first chapter and go into a little more depth about how you create an immersive world. Specifically, we'll talk about language and meaning and how these relate to the foundation of an immersive space. We'll also address how you create a project from the ground up. We'll talk about the value of storytelling as it relates to creating creative spaces. And we will focus on the key elements of something that I call design storytelling. In the first part of the chapter, I begin with what I call a provocation. And this is one of a few set of key features that you'll find throughout the chapters of the text. And in this provocation, I asked designers to reflect on the idea of a blank space. In the text itself, there'll be an image of a fairly blank room. It's basically a white room, and there's nothing exciting or immersive about this room. And I use this as a way to challenge the designer to basically say, what would you do with this space? Where would you begin? Where would it end? And ultimately, the design choices that you've made, how will those relate to the enjoyment of the guest? And one of the keys I'll be stressing throughout this text is that everything you do as a designer always has to fall back on the idea that the guest is the reason that any of these spaces exist in the first place. So following this provocation, I move into the idea of the meaning of a space. And I ask some questions about specifically, what does a space mean to you? Think back to those incredibly evocative spaces that you visited as a child. Perhaps they were theme parks or a park down the street or someplace that had a lot of meaning for you. And I try to take that as an ideal to say, okay, how would you then create that in terms of giving meaning to your own immersive consumer space? One of the ways that you can look at this is, how do you name the space itself? Does the naming of the space involve any product or brand associations? Does it fall on pre-existing contexts? Are there cultural or psychological associations that people might have with the space once you name it? And beyond the issue of naming the space, we'll talk about the idea of what I call adapting languages. And this is really the idea of looking as broadly as possible at some creative ways to establish a space and the meaning behind the space. For example, can you use the notion of editing in film to think about edits you might also develop in your own space, perhaps a theme park, where you move the guests from point A to point B to C to D, and in that process you develop jump cuts or transitions or motion blurs that would basically mimic the language that would be used in cinema or film. So I'll fall back on a series of key forms of adapting languages and talk about these in the context of your own design spaces. I then talk about the idea of the story. And here I give some overview, not a lot, but a brief overview of what stories mean to people. Why are stories so important to people in really universally all cultures throughout the world? And I think when you look at this from culture to culture, you could say that stories often teach us important lessons. They involve heroes or key situations that folks like Joseph Campbell talked about in their theories of monomyth. They give us ideals or values that we can follow. They tell us what's right in life and what's wrong. They distract us from the hard things that we often endure in our everyday lives. They give us things we can relate to. And they really allow us to experience things that we often wouldn't be able to experience firsthand. And in looking at stories, we'll actually move into the issue of or the concept of what's called a design story. And here I talk about the real challenges. How do you take an evocative story, a story, say, like of Gilgamesh, where you have a great story of a hero, and translate that into a context that has material culture, that has architecture, that has technology, rides, moving attractions, things that you want people to buy, brand associations, and so forth. It's really, I think, one of the greatest challenges, but we can't forget that the benefit of using a story is that you're going to draw people in. When I think back on any of the great theme park rides that I've enjoyed as a kid and still enjoy as an adult, such as Pirates of the Caribbean, it was really because there was something evocative about the spaces, and also the fact that there were characters and story situations going on in terms of the setting, the plot, the the movement of the characters through different vignettes, and as an entire story, you were left, as you exited the Q house of that ride, Pirates of the Caribbean, you were left with incredible associations and really vivid meanings because of the use of stories. And so we'll talk about stories through a concept of what I call the design story. The design story is really all about adapting these meanings, these forms of language that I've talked about, into an architectural space, into a consumer space that guests truly will enjoy. At the end of the book, we'll have 2 additional interviews, and one will be with Margaret King. And I met Margaret years ago at a Theming Entertainment Association conference in Orlando, and I was really impressed with just her broad vision of how culture could be brought into the discussion of how we create immersive and themed spaces. And she represents the Center for Cultural Studies and Analysis consulting firm. The second interview will be with a professional who's actually in the field and someone who has designed a themed space. And he is someone who designed the Industrial Revolution Bar and Grill located in Valparaiso, Indiana, which is actually the hometown where I grew up. And his name is Mike Leeson. He's the owner and president of Synergy Steel Structures, and as I said, the Industrial Revolution Bar and Grill. And he'll talk about in his interview some of his interesting life history experiences and his passion for the American spirit of the steel worker, and how he attempted to translate this into this very unique themed restaurant that tries to focus on the inspirations of the Industrial Revolution and steelmaking in a very innovative bar and grill concept. So I hope you'll enjoy this chapter. I think it's a pretty interesting one that gets you more into the specifics of designing exciting themed and immersive spaces. And thanks, and I'll talk to you in the next chapter overview.